What's up, my comic comrades? With Marvel Studios' What If series in full swing on Disney+, we're continuing our own series focused on the What If stories from Marvel Comics. This time with What If Peter Parker became the Punisher. It's a super interesting premise, as Peter Parker, or Spider-Man, is the farthest thing from an anti-hero. Nevertheless, we're going to find out what Marvel thought that would look like. Anyway, let's see what would happen if Parker became the Punisher. The issue starts off with us getting the origin of this Punisher Spider-Man, which obviously is very similar to the main 616 Spider-Man. We see Peter Parker on a field trip to a science lab where he gets bitten by a radioactive spider. Except the spider we see has a Punisher-looking skull on its abdomen. After Peter gets bit, he seems to realize that he's developed spider-like powers. And because of that, opportunities present themselves. Opportunities to turn his life around, as he says. As we see him enter into a wrestling match, defeating Crusher Hogan, winning $100. Again, all stuff that's pretty much identical to the main 616 Spider-Man. The man who runs the wrestling event tells Peter, "With an act like yours, I can make us a fortune on TV. Play up that mask act. It's great showmanship." Peter says to himself, showmanship? He hasn't seen anything yet. We then see Peter in his bedroom talking to his Aunt May and Uncle Ben while he's hiding his web shooters and costume behind his back, saying to himself, "I designed a costume and web shooters reflecting what I observed from the spider." Ben and May were the only ones who had ever been kind to me. Money was always tight, but they stretched to keep me in science books and equipment. We then see Peter on a TV show saying, after the first few talk show appearances, everyone wanted a piece of the guy who was as much an arachnid as a man. And that meant real income. Now that I had the power to return the favor, I'd see to it that May and Uncle Ben would always be happy. The rest of the world could go hang. As we see that infamous moment of Peter letting a burglar escape, saying to the security guard, "Sorry pal, that's your job." When Peter gets home, the cops tell him, "Sorry to inform you, Peter Parker, but your uncle was shot, killed by a burglar he surprised in the house." And we all know what happens from here. Spider-Man goes to hunt down this burglar at a warehouse where the police have him cornered, where he arrives in his Spider-Man costume with a skull on his chest, all Punisher style. Peter grabs the gun from the burglar and shoots him in the chest, while the reporter tries to take pictures of the whole thing. But then the floor breaks out from under them, but Spidey saves him. As he catches the reporter with his webbing, the camera snaps a picture of Spider-Man. He then leaves the reporter webbed to the rafters. Later on, we see Peter holding the Daily Bugle newspaper that reads, "Punisher Spider terrorizes the city," and says to himself, "Uncle Ben always said that with great power, there must also come great responsibility." So when J. Jonah Jameson warped reality to sell newspapers, I didn't care. I vowed there would be no more innocent victims like Uncle Ben while it was within my power to prevent them, by any means. Even if others vilified me for it. He goes on to say, "By rigging a remote camera before I pounced on a villain, I was able to capture extraordinary shots of my alter ego in action." Though the Bugle's editorial carried J. Jonah Jameson's bias, he paid better for my photos than any other newspaper. Peter keeps narrating, telling us so far he managed to apprehend or chase off his antagonist without needing to use the gun he took from Uncle Ben's killer. But superpowered rogues kept coming back to seek revenge for past defeats. With each encounter, these villains became more vicious and dangerous. The Green Goblin was the most persistent. Seeing the Green Goblin shrug off policemen's shots to the heart was a wake-up call. Later I found out when the bullets hit his reactive armor, that section of the armor exploded outward, negating the projectile's penetration force. So it was clear to Peter that he needed some tricks of his own to stop psychopaths from endangering innocents. So he designed a small caliber chain gun magazine that fit into his web shooters, and sensors in his palms allowed him to call up a range of ammo types: high explosive, armor piercing, incendiary, and EMP. Peter then tells us, with my new adaptations complementing my trusty web fluid, I feel prepared for anything. As we see the Punishing Spider, which Jameson gladly dubbed him, swinging through the city. Peter's first test with his new equipment was against the Sinister Six. As Peter tells us, my EMP rounds fried Electro. There was no messing around with Kraven. Explosive rounds for the Mad Russian. After an exhausting bout with Mysterio's robot X-Men, the coup de grace was delivered up close and personal. Incendiary rounds turned Sand and Sandman to glass for easy shattering. Without their power source, Vulture's wings became useless decorations. For the brilliant Dr. Octopus, who masterminded the scheme, my armor-piercing rounds turned his mechanical arms to shrapnel. I then saw pictures of defeating and killing the Sinister Six to the Bugle, saying I felt slightly guilty making money for the photos I took for the Sinister Six demise. Slightly. Eventually, we see Peter graduate high school and start college at Empire State University, where he meets his new roommate, Harry Osborn. It's also in college where Peter meets and falls in love with Gwen Stacy. And with the distraction of college and Peter being absolutely smitten by Gwen, his attention shifted away from crime fighting. But with fewer sightings of the Punisher or the Punishing Spider, the war for control on the Metro Underworld slowly heated back up, with innocents sometimes caught in the crossfire as mob factions fought over who should rule the New York City rackets. The Kingpin consolidated things, and Peter made sure that he now consolidated only in hell. That's right, he killed the Kingpin. We then see Peter and Gwen go on a double date with Harry and MJ, and after this, Peter tells us that the Green Goblin remains the most deadly and resilient of his foes. He was able to nullify my spider sense with a drug and followed me, learned my identity, and attacked and tied me up with more Oscorp tech, leaving me helpless. Green Goblin then reveals himself to be Norman Osborn, the father of Peter's roommate, Harry. Peter then tells Norman, the only way you could finally beat me, Osborn, was by drugging me and binding me. Osborn replies, I always won our battles. Others interfered to let you escape. I'm prepared to prove it. Go ahead, suit up, minus your firepower. Osborn then puts his mask back on and lets Peter go. Peter then says, but I use firepower of a different sort, as he uses his webbing to grab a bunch of stuff in the room and pulls it in, smashing Green Goblin, which temporarily knocks Osborn back to his normal self, not knowing what's going on or why he's in a goblin costume. Peter then tells us his amnesia. I hoped it would keep my secret safe from adversaries as well as those who cared about me. It worked for a while, but months later, still recovering from our last encounter and under the stress of Oscorp's decline in value, Norman Osborn began to unravel. Whatever mental dam that had held back Osborn and his memories of the goblin past catastrophically failed. Osborn geared up to seek his revenge. And with that, Goblin wanted to hit Peter where it would hurt the most, so he kidnapped Gwen and took her to the Brooklyn Bridge. Goblin then tells the Punisher, or Punishing Spider, Mr. Parker, if you wish Gwen Stacy to live, you must die. Remove your wrist shooters and jump off this tower while making no attempt to save yourself. Do that and I'll let her live. From this height, that fall will kill you. The impact will just be icing on the cake. You have to the count of 3. Peter then says to himself, unless Osborn's dead, now and forever, no one I cared about would ever be safe. Firing an armor-piercing round followed by 2 Teflon-jacketed slugs, I hope my cobbled-together tech would counter the best Oscorp tech their research could produce, and that I could make all the rounds strike the same spot. And guess what? Peter's cobbled-together tech actually worked, piercing the goblin's armor, killing him, but also causing him and Gwen to free fall to the ground. Peter then uses his web line to catch Gwen just like he did in the main Marvel reality. But this time she lived as he was able to swing her into some nearby scaffolding and make her come to with some mouth-to-mouth. She then wakes up saying, Peter? He says, yes, it's Peter Parker. She then tells him, you saved me. He replies, I'm afraid I almost got you killed. Captions of Peter then say, in the high-stakes superhero world, those I cannot save were doomed to die. It seemed there was no in-between, as Harry mourns his father's death and blames the Punisher, vowing to do what the cops can't. Stop the Punisher. Peter then goes to a hospital to visit Gwen, where she's recovering, saying to himself, I thought I was protecting my loved ones. More often than not, being a vigilante resulted in escalating cycles of violence. It was way past time to come clean with Gwen and concentrate on being a good boyfriend, a good husband, if she would have me. Meanwhile, back at Spider-Man's apartment at 2:27 a.m. in the morning, he's listening to the news as they're reporting on a complex gun and drug trafficking scheme involving the Costa crime family. While Peter is listening to the news report, he picks up the Punisher costume and starts ripping it up, saying, I had the power, the responsibility to make the woman I love happy. And I almost botched it. Never again. I chose a path of love, not vengeance. And that's made all the difference. As he brings his costume into an alley and throws it into a trash can, which is an homage to the iconic page from Amazing Spider-Man issue 15 in the Spider-Man No More story. We then get a panel of Peter and Gwen happy and living their life to the fullest, with him no longer the Punisher. Meanwhile, in Central Park, Costa gunmen abducted a former banker and money launderer, Forrest Hunt, who they hung up and tortured in the park. Unfortunately though, the Castle family, both parents, the son, and daughter, were gunned down when they stumbled across Hunt's abductors in the act. But we see Frank Castle didn't die as he mourns over his family's bodies. He then gets away, hobbling to a nearby alley where he falls into a trash can, which just so happens to be the same trash can that Peter Parker put his Punisher costume into. The costume then lands on top of Castle with the skull on his chest as the comic ends. And that, my friends, is what would have happened if Peter Parker became the Punisher. Essentially, he would kill a crap ton of his rogues, including the Green Goblin. But him and Gwen would live happily ever after once he gave up the role of Punisher, which would inevitably fall into the hands of Frank Castle, who in this world would become the second Punisher. Pretty interesting if I do say so myself. I'm a big fan of alternate realities, Elseworld stories, and all that kind of stuff, so I found this pretty cool. But what did you guys think of the Punishing Spider or Peter Parker as the Punisher? Let us know down in the comments. First up for the week of August 24th, we have Robin issue 5. Robin reunion, Nightwing, Red Hood, Tim Drake, and spoiler guest star as they track down Damian with a plan to bring the young hero back to Gotham. Back to his family. Next, we have Thor issue 16. Thor has only known 2 things, being a warrior and wielding a hammer. But he is realizing that in order to be the best ruler of Asgard that he can be, he must give up those 2 things. Who is Thor without them? Here we have Alien issue 6. If you didn't know, Marvel has been putting out an Alien series based off the popular film franchise. I've been hearing good things so far, so it's time to marathon read, and if you like the films, you should as well. And that's gonna bring today's episode of Variant to a close, but if you like today's video, check out this one right here, and if you like all of our content, as I always say, subscribe, like, and comment. It always helps the channel out. But other than that, I'll see you guys next time. We'll talk about all things comics.